Okay, very good. I want to welcome everybody here tonight. As you know, we've been in session since 5:30, and we will continue to be in session. Our next item on our agenda tonight is at 7:30, which is our citizen time. Obviously, many of you may speak at that, I suspect, but the discussion that we are going to have tonight is, in my view, just the beginning. So let me say thank you to a couple of folks. Thank you to the joint finance committees of both the school board and the city council. I know they've met numerous times and ultimately came up with one recommendation. We're going to get to that in just a moment because I'd like to have staff or perhaps the chairman let us know what that motion was. But again, I'd like to thank all three members of the school board's finance committee and all three members of the city's finance committee. In addition to Ms. Sebastian, I think you acted one night, I believe.
That's good.
In addition, I want to welcome the school board members. It's good to have you here tonight for some important conversations. As is evidenced by the folks that are here, take a look around this room. You'll see more people here tonight than we have at a budget work session. More people here tonight than we had at the approval of our budget for next year. And I think that's indicative of the importance of what we are about to take up. And I'll speak to that in just a moment. So again, I'll be asking the chairman what the recommendation was, and perhaps I did not bring those.
Are they in here? Are they at your seat? No, she's left. Did you read it?
So everyone knows, we do have minutes of the final meeting of the Joint Finance Committee, and I'd like you all to take a look at that. Obviously, we cannot approve that. The Joint Finance Committee has to approve that, but certainly you all can indicate whether what is in it is correct. And I think it's important for us to know exactly what the recommendation is. And as I remember, it was 3.5%, 3.5%, and 3.5% for each of the next 3 years, absent what the next step is in order to afford a new Dean Elementary School. Again, if anyone suggests that that's incorrect, let me know. And as I understand that motion, which passed on a 4-2 basis, that motion was to take up Dean at a later time. You'll hear a recommendation from me with regard to that in just a few moments. And again, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the school board. I want to thank the city council and our citizens particularly. I happen to believe that not very many communities could do what we have accomplished over many years in trying to work together for our schools. We've built a new Osborne. We've added on to Hayden and Weems. We've built a new Mayfield. We've built a new Baldwin. And hopefully we're about to build a new Dean. I know that city council members have got a big job here. And each of you may have individual and differing perspectives. We're here today to try to make, and tonight and from now on, to try to make Manassas the best it can be, while being considerate of the dollars that we take from our citizens. And so you'll know a couple of expectations. I think we all expect, every one of us expects a good civil discourse, open discussion. In fact, I received today, thank you, ma'am, I received today an email urging me to make sure that the discussions that we are taking up be done in open session. I guess it was a little odd to me to get that, because of course we're gonna have it in the open session. I was somewhat disturbed that somebody thought it might be otherwise. These kinds of discussions need to be had in the community, and they need to be transparent, and all of our citizens need to hear about them. We should be asking questions. We should be considering data. We should be understanding all of the issues and considerate and respectful of one another. This discussion is important to our city. We all know that, but its potential long-term nature, 3 years, long-term, maybe not. I've had a council member tonight tell me maybe it could be 5 years. And we will be taking up about one of the single largest increases in taxes on our citizens in its history. This should be well considered, debated, and transparent to all of our citizens, as I said before. So I recommend to council members, take your time. Ask staff and others, including the school board and the school staff and our staff, for the information that you need. Give guidance to staff as it's needed. For example, if you wish to move forward with a motion, I'm not suggesting it should be done tonight, by the way, you should, in my view, ask staff to create a resolution that would be taken up behind the dais, so all of our citizens see it. Like you, I have questions, as I'm sure that you do. We should all have our questions answered before action is taken. And I will have further suggestions for you to consider. This council is the governing body, not me. I probably, though I probably will not get a vote. So this council is the governing body. And I've told council members that over many years. The school board has a job to do. It's a very, very important job to do. And it speaks to the future of our city, our state, and our country. So we all know that. But this governing body has a slightly different job to do. It's got to make the decision about how much money we take from our citizens to accomplish the things that we need or want to accomplish within the city. By the way, and this, I'll end on this, aside from having you all take a look at the minutes. What you're about is going to make a difference in the city. It could, and I hope you make sure of this, help our schools be better. And I hope you consider all the pieces to it. For example, you're taking up tonight one recommendation with regard to the schools. You already know there's a second. The second is Dean and what money that takes. So you're being asked to consider tax increases for 3 years, at least as far as I understand the motion to be. And you're told that the Joint Finance Committee should, and I believe it should, take up a discussion about Dean. But I urge you not to forget that that's not done in a vacuum. And I think this is where citizens need to consider as well. It's not done in a vacuum. What will our police need? What will our fire and rescue need? What will our shared services need? And we already know that there's a jail being built that we must help fund. So I urge you to treat this discussion much like a budget discussion. so you know all things that will come into the future requirements and responsibilities of the city. It's a challenging and daunting situation, as is evidenced by the crowd here tonight. A very important discussion. So I appreciate you allowing me to have a few thoughts and comments, and I guess we will take up the discussion now. I will say we've had a lot of information in the Joint Finance Committee meeting. You've had the school's draft of their budget. You've had Davenport and Company report to the Joint Committee. You've had a diagram showing what the tax rate will do based upon a 2% rise in the city forecast, 2% growth in real estate, and what the schools are requesting. A lot to discuss. And of course, you had this document, which I think the other night, a couple of weeks ago, led to the motion that was made. So, did I get the motion correct?
So thank you, Your Honor. Actually, there was 3 scenarios, and I'm looking at the unofficial minutes. They have not been approved by the committee, so I just want to make that point. So I am the chair on the council side, and Mr. Albrecht, who's not here, is the chair. On the school board side, I would just like to say thank you to Mr. Albrecht for working with me, even though he's not here. So 3 scenarios were presented at our 4th meeting on Wednesday, May 30th. There was the current agreement, which was 2.625% per year, which is about 2.5 cents. There was a school request for operating and capital, which was 2.625 and then 14% and then 4.47% for a total of 23.5 cent operating and capital over the next 3 years. And then there was another scenario presented by Mr. Elston, a 1-2-3 proposal, which was 3 cents, 3.5 cents, or 3 cents as presented. Neither of those scenarios were approved. There were motions made, but they weren't seconded. The motion that eventually was approved was for Mr. DeMaria, that was just for operating costs at 3.5 cents for 3 years. And that was for operating costs only, did not include funding for a new dean. That was left to be determined by the committee. And that was a 4-2 vote, and that was the last action that the committee took. So as it stands now, the Joint Finance Committees have voted by 4-2 to do a joint resolution for school funding with an increase for operating costs of 3.5 cents for 3 years, and a separate consideration that was not addressed for how to fund a new dean elementary school. Mr. Mayor, and that's what was left by my math. That's 10.5 cents in 3 years for operating costs just for the school.
Okay. I am going to call on any council member that raises his hand. Mr. Elston is going to be first, but I was also going to call on the members of the Finance Committee, and of course Mr. Elston as well. Mr. Elston.
Thank you. Just to clarify just a couple things about those, because there were, I don't think scenario 2 was ever actually promoted. I don't know that that's reflected in our minutes. But there were 4 scenarios that had proposals discussed. As Mr. Avani described 2 of them, I do want to clarify scenario 3 on this paper, because on this page, and this page was presented by staff. So,
by the way, Mr. Elston, I have asked our staff to make copies of that. We're going to make them relatively available.
yeah, that's good. But the staff has attached those tax increases. The proposal I would submit in terms of clarification does not include those tax increases. I mean, that is really a very significant part of our discussion here. How do we get to it, and how do we get to these numbers? I have a couple questions about these numbers, actually. So that's the clarification that I really wanted to make, is that this tax impact piece that Mr. Avani is suggesting is attached to these scenarios. Those aren't exactly equal, right? That keeping a 2.625%, which was Mr. Avani's proposal, and he made the motion to do that. On this piece of paper says that would be 7.5 cents over 3 years. The proposal that I made, and I do certainly question these numbers in particular, is really a phased proposal. So when we talk about, and that has, by the way, according to this paper, a 9.5 cent increase, but the purpose of our discussion really should take all of that into account and really try to get to the root of it, because the proposal that I made was not for those increases. The proposal that I made was to very much tie the last audited year to a percentage to go to the schools that would phase dependent on how the economy goes. So these projections that are on this paper are staff presented, but those weren't the proposals that were on the table. So that's the clarification I'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Austin. Mr. Wolf?
Yeah, I'd also point out, I mean, since the penny is worth $477,000, Mr. Avini has misstated the motion that was approved was for 3.5% per year, not cents. It would be somewhat less than 3.5 cents a year. It would probably be 2.5. Doesn't add up. Maybe that-
Let me ask about that. According to that, 3% is pretty closely equivalent to 3 cents. Is that correct?
That's right. If you take the scenario that we've given the council, that we've used in our forecast, with the 2% assessment growth, and basically a little slightly less than 2% city growth, and then the only variable that we're changing is the amount of request, the amount that is being proposed to fund the schools, and we plug those in to determine a tax rate that you would need to fund that scenario based on those assumptions. And the numbers that are under here are the numbers that we came out in running those assumptions. And I will say, Mr. Elston, we made our best guess based on the 17, 18, and 19 budgets, because the 19 budget was just passed. We don't have actuals for that. 18 is, we don't have actuals, but we've got a pretty good sense of where that one's going to be at, and we do have the actuals for 17. So under the formula that he created, the 17 number of 3% is accurate, but for 2020. And then for 18, I can tell you that we already know that it'll be higher than the formula, so it would allow for 3.5, because we already know we've got that much growth. And then the 19, which would equate to 22, that number is still, that's based on budgeted, but not on actuals.
So part of my concern, just to be clear, although that we did walk through that, and I appreciate that the projections are just what they are. But one thing that this scenario page does not include is how much is actually being generated. And I think that would be important for us to see in terms of real dollars.
Okay.
It may be that the cumulative revenue of these increases is in this scenario. I'm not certain that it is, so I would really like to see that. Because obviously you raise taxes in 1 year, there is a cumulative effect moving forward. So I want to make sure that these percentages aren't coming off, stagnant numbers.
No, the percent, I can tell you, we can provide that information, the backup data to this. The percentages were based, as we all with all our forecasts. So we started with the budget that you just approved for 19 as a base, and then whatever percentage is showing in those columns, that's the amount we added to that year, and then that would create a new number that would add the percentage for the second year and the third year. Is that what you're asking?
Right, but that number that we add in that first year still exists in the second year. So I want to see
Correct.
that cumulative growth and see what those numbers are, so that we can compare apples to apples, which is a request to a funding model.
We can provide those raw numbers too. No problem.
Mr. Olson, let me make sure I understand. That first year, if you add 3.5%, The second year you had 3.5%, that's 3.5% on the original year plus 3.5% on the first year.
Exactly, and so I wanna see that growth, I just wanna look at the numbers, because we have some, your introduction included the fact that we have some real challenges in front of us that we have to take up with that. And we fought very hard on this council to do something in terms of the capital investment plan, to look down the road, to try to be responsive now. And Davenport was very clear. That saved our citizens money, that helped our rating, and it is responsive in a way that isn't going to make these kinds of big jumps. And however we wrap our head around the needs in front of us, I think we need to take on a similar sort of strategy. With so many schools in the city, we're probably looking, you said maybe a 5-year plan. In some ways, in terms of capital investment, we may have to be making, and I don't say this flippantly, a 20, 30-year investment plan, 60-year investment plan, because we're ultimately, as a city, going to face about a school a decade. And if we don't do something in terms of planning now, we're going to be at this table, well, somebody is, won't be us, in 60 years, but really butting heads and trying to solve problems that we should try to get it in front of.
I think from my own perspective, Mr. Elston is exactly right. We ought to be taking up the debt of the city and the debt of the schools, perhaps even together. And I think you probably ought to plan on a school every 10 years. And if you're creating the revenue to be able to accomplish that on an annual basis as opposed to all at once, that's probably a good way to do it.
Can I add to that statement for just a moment? Because I think, one of the things that came out of this discussion, just so everybody's aware, when we did separate operating versus building capital investment, we spent a lot of time looking at debt service. Davenport spent a lot of time looking at debt service. And when you look at that, there is a sincere drop-off in 2022. And we did, 2022 is where it starts to fall below that red line, and then we get a much bigger one in 2026. So we have sort of step downs, and we did talk with the school board members of the joint committee about starting to move Dean in our planning 5 years out or so. There was some question as to whether that's groundbreaking in 5 years or ribbon cutting in 5 years. Obviously, we'll have to take that up. But it certainly, in terms of the math, helps us. And I think your point, and it's one of the reasons I dog-eared page 13 when we first got this presentation, looking at page 13 in Davenport's review, is proposed debt service ratio, city and school debt. And it's very important that we make sure those numbers are accurate and that city and school debt is on everybody's radar. And that we understand what the schools have in their budget for debt moving down the road, so that it's not a complete scenario, if you will.
Ms. Beck.
Yes. Agreed, Mr. Elston. At our last meeting, and when Davenport presented, I wrote down some key points, and I actually asked for clarification from them at some point too. And they answered that all 3 of the key debt ratios that we would use on good financing, good debt affordability were there. So I see this, we don't have much time, but I saw this as a next step to a discussion. Although most of our council members were there at all of our meetings, and most of the school board members too, we obviously had meetings with the two finance committees. This is bringing together council, looking at each council member and having this serious discussion. So although it was set at a higher percentage, the 3.5%, because it wasn't 3.5 cents, 3.5%. And although Dean was not included in that discussion, what Mr. Elston just said, some other points that I wrote down were considering Dean 5 years or further in the future. looking at how we can have solutions and using our debt affordability, both council and school board, to come up with those solutions. Instead of, let's just keep it the way it is for another year, we'll see what happens, and that to me, that was not a solution. I mean, we needed to be bold and make a bold decision, at least to come to a conversation. I knew there wasn't going to be a vote from council on this. I wanted to see it as a work session. I wish we had more time tonight, but I know this will be a continuing, long time discussion in the next several months too.
We'll take the time.
Yes. So I guess I'm pretty much just confirming some of the points that you wanted to. And I circled and I starred debt capacity. And from that report from Davenport, I was encouraged that we could perhaps have staff and we could look at that being more, how can we afford these solutions without just throwing out there, oh, there's going to be, I mean, it's been misrepresented in the press, both online and in the paper too, on what the tax rate would be. It's not all about the tax rate. It's about solutions and how we can have our schools succeed and be the best that they are, and what we can do best for services in our city too. So again, debt affordability, where we go in the future with that, and I really considered this a starting point.
Any other thoughts?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
I would just make the point that the tax rate is important, and the scenario that was voted upon, just to be clear, is only for operating costs at all. It does not include any capital. So to me, for my 1/6 vote, if you're going to separate operating from capital, we've got a real big issue, because you're talking about 10.5-cent increase just for operating. We still haven't dealt with the issue of Dean. For me, I would like to see both of them dealt with at the same time, so we don't split the costs and get a 10.5-cent increase and then come back and do another increase for Dean. That was the vote that was made.
Mr. Vaney, I tend to agree with you. As you heard in my earlier statement, I think the council needs to be very careful here to take a look at all of the components of the expenditures of the city, including our police and fire and rescue, and I recognize that we've got a separate fund for the fire and rescue, but we certainly fund police. I suspect that that is going to continue to grow. And the example that I gave that which indicates that I think that the council should take a look at all these other pieces in addition to Dean with this conversation. The example that I gave was the jail that's under construction right now that we all know we don't have a number for. It's not in our budget. We know we're going to have to fund it. It's probably about $1 million a year just for that new position, in addition to the shared services that we already have. So it's $1 million probably in addition that we haven't got in the budget.
Sure, why not? Miss Madden, can you put up the slide?
It's gonna take me a minute, let's turn it off. We're gonna be upstairs.
Maybe I could say something?
No.
You're
Want to give me another
Different
one of these, Mr. Wolf?
Fire away, knock yourself.
Want to give me another one? I got mine. Mr. Mayor, while we're doing this, the mayor's make a comment, a brief comment.
I think the way I look at it, Mr. Wolf gave his time to you, Ms. Sebeski. I had actually seen Mr. Love for his hand first, but I'll call on Ms. Sebeski.
I'll also defer to this.
Thank you.
The lady from here.
I just wanted to make the difference in the proposal, that scenario 1 and scenario 3, in some cases is not even a half a cent. I would like to see the data from our finance department regarding, what that percentage in the actual cent, how they actually work out. If we could get more of that data the next time we speak. But the one thing I wanted to say
What are
is
you asking for there?
where the percentage and the actual cents, to showing us.
You want to know the same question Mr.
Yes.
Upton asked, what are the dollars generated?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. So I wanted to just say that I agree with that. But I just wanted to say publicly, because this came up in these joint meetings, is that when 3 years ago, when the current agreement was negotiated, the schools and the city council members that sat here talked a lot about the joint needs of the city. That it wasn't just about the school needs, it was about the shared services, it was about many different things. And the schools agreed to this. Personally, being someone who was sitting here, I knew at the time the schools were gonna actually receive less money under this agreement than the previous agreement that they had. But there were needs that needed to be met across our city, and we are all one, so we all have to work together. Over the last 3 years, the schools have received approximately, it was told in our meeting, approximately $4 million less. And yet they've remained accredited, they've done good work, and they continue to go forward. But in that same time, hundreds of more children continue to come into our school system, meaning that we're funding the schools at the same cost per child as we did in 2006. So I think as Mrs. Bass said, I am looking forward to more creative conversations here, because these are solutions we have to come up with. We can't just not take care of needs across the whole board, the schools or the city.
Can I ask for clarification on
Yes, sir.
I know
Yes, sir.
whenever we get around to
Yes,
it,
sir.
this is one place on the
Sure,
deck.
Mr.
I don't know where I am.
Deck.
Sure,
But I
but
do want
it's
to,
just fine with clarification, and we'll get back to Mr. Wolf too.
at some point, I do want to hear about the clarification of the per pupil expenditure. And I'm asking for it because I see it here. I think the part of Mr. Wolf's presentation in gold there in parts is based on per pupil expenditure. So I want to hear if just a clarification of what you just said in terms of the numbers we're spending are 2006 numbers as opposed to 2014, 15 numbers when we put this
I'll look through the documents the school gave you on, I think the first or the second joint work session
Okay, they're in here.
is what they gave us the per pupil cost. I can look through my handouts while we
And then, so then the follow-up would be when we get to it, Mr. Wolf, you could address that.
Are you talking about that, Mr. Wolf?
No, I'm talking about per pupil expenditure. I'll find it.
It's in the red folder.
I have it, I just haven't. But if you could address that when you.
I think I can.
Mr. Wolf?
All right, what you have in front of you, top part is the information I asked the schools, and they were gracious enough to provide. What I'm trying to accomplish here is splitting the school expenditures into capital versus operating. We have to solve both issues, but I think they're separate issues, and there may be a piecemeal approach to getting there. So, to give you an example, so this is projected enrollment for the schools, this is their projected staff, teachers, number of staff. As a business person, I just look at this and give credit to the schools. This makes sense. There's not adding a huge number of teachers or anything else in here. This is sort of maintenance of effort, I guess, is for lack of a better term. You've got the funding side, the schools projected by the city, which is based on the current 2.625 agreement. So I went back and said, all right, let's try to calculate what the city gives, goes into two buckets. We have an operating bucket, we provide all of the capital. State and federal money does not go to capital, correct? Andy?
It's true.
Okay. So with that, we've got an expenditures per student. So I've got a total, from this number, their operating expenditures divided by the number of students, an estimated operating expenditures per student, and you see the increase, which again is pretty much what you would assume inflation to be over time. You've got teachers per student. It slightly goes up over time, which you would expect in a growing population base. There'll be some additional economies of scale. The same thing for staff, so that there's no red flags there. Then we get down to Manassas funding. Can you scroll down under? Bring that up. Manassas funding for students. The difference year over year. All other funding, and then go all the way down to the bottom. Okay. So what I've tried to do here, and this is an approach. This is not chiseled in stone. This is not totally written, but we've got
The prior year, we know there were 7,771 students. We know that the city contributed $6,016 in operating per student to the schools. The rest, the city gave $9,346,000 in capital that year, the total of $56 million. So if you take this number of students, and basically take this number, the 6,016, as a maintenance of effort for operating, give an inflation factor, and this assumes 2% a year. Obviously, it will vary. But also multiplying that by the projected enrollment numbers and the guesstimated city funding for operating, which is a maintenance of effort at the current level. What I've done here is said, all right, again, we've got the $9.3 million of capital this year. If you assume that going straight line going forward, and that becomes the big question, is if with the city contributing $9.3 million, hopefully there is money coming from the state, coming to the schools from the law that passed this year, and I will throw out as an idea to the council is frankly that Dean is more important than a library. And we have $10 million in bonding capacity that we're going to build into the CIP. We have already got that built into the tax rate. We are already collecting that money and putting it in our CIP. What I would ask or suggest is if we can agree that this works in operating, can the staffs go back and say, if you take the library plus the 9.3 plus whatever the windfalls coming from the state in terms of capital, at that point, if that's your box, when can you build Dean? And for how much? Without a further increase in taxes. That's, to me, becomes the question. Mr. Pate and I have done some analysis, and this gets back to what the mayor said. What's gotten us into this bind is we're building 2 schools too quickly. We need to plan a school a decade. If we do that, the tax rate that we have will sustain that. When we have greater demand than that, we do not have the bonding, the taxing capacity to handle it. Hopefully, I know I don't know this for a fact, hopefully the library part can make the gap so that we're not actually waiting until 2026 or 27 to build Dean. I don't know that. I give this to staff. The other thing I would ask of staffs, and this is on the school side, is, and I pointed this out before, the per capita construction cost for proposed Dean is 60% greater than the per capita cost of Baldwin. It doesn't pass my smell test. We need to really look at those numbers and understand, because if we are talking about $48 million for Dean as opposed to $54 million, it's a hell of a difference at the end of the day. And we need to have a better idea as to what, and maybe 54 is the right number, but I don't know where that number came from. And I think we all need, before we make this decision, we've got to understand what's the bogey we're trying to operate against. Questions?
Mr. Ludwig.
Can a hypothetical windfall from the state be used for capital, or would you envision that offsetting operation costs?
I would offset operating.
And that would be something
yeah,
that
exactly.
That's,
Yeah.
hey.
And that goes to, at the last meeting I talked about, if the schools would consider earmarking that. Yeah.
I am, in that regard, I am curious, and I guess the schools have to answer this, maybe Dr. Gork or Andy. State's now got a budget. And what was the number that you got from the state? Was it greater, less, or something like what you expected and put in your budget?
It's greater, but at this time we need to present our recommendation to the school board, because school board members are not privy to it yet. So it just came in on Friday.
Okay.
And so we have not had a chance. Mr. Hawkins has contacted our finance chair.
I'm a process guy. I understand that.
Okay.
I think it should go to the school board before here as well, even though a lot of your school board members are here. But I think that's appropriate.
They just need to find out.
It's
first.
appropriate, absolutely. That's another piece of information that certainly I'd love to see. Mr. Wolf, any other thoughts?
I just, again, I throw this out just to have a conversation and try to move this forward.
So let me ask just a little bit. So you're suggesting an approach that might be able to solve D.
That would maintain current levels of support for the schools on an operating basis, based on enrollment, which has always been one of the key things that we've heard coming from the folks in schools, and I get that, I understand that. I don't see a scenario, social media, there's been a lot of people saying more money doesn't guarantee more results, and I absolutely understand that, but less money is almost certainly a guarantee of poorer results. And so I think it's important that we maintain the level of effort that we have for the schools from the operating side. To me, that then it becomes, we've got the how do we take the box that's left and fit deed into that? And maybe that's creative financing, maybe that's step financing, maybe it's waiting a couple of years. I don't have that answer. Don't pretend.
Yeah. Let me ask Mr. Pate a question. Mr. Pate, I'm trying to remember, and I'm not sure I do completely or correctly. I'm trying to remember the debt service number that was in the school's budget for the current year and then the next year. And as I remember, one of them was something like $7 million of debt service in the I want to say current year, and then something like $5.5 million in the following year. How does that compare to the $9.3 million?
I believe the 9.3 million that's been picked up here includes the $3 million from pay-as-you-go capital.
Correct, it does.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor?
Sorry, Mr. Vaney. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Just a clarification, Mr. Wolf, when you say maintain the current operating agreement, are you referring to 2.625?
No, I'm not saying maintain the operating, I said maintain the level of commitment of effort. I'm not saying operating agreement. I would.
What percentage are you talking about? We didn't put a percentage.
Not a percentage. It's, I am going back to more of a dollar.
Dollar, but you have translated it into the percentages at the bottom. So,
Well,
sorry,
what you have down here is if you maintain the current, this year's city capital contribution plus the operating agreement, that's a 1% increase over what we provided in 2017, I believe it was. And you'll see it's roughly, and I did out 5 years. I think the other thing the mayor alluded to this, I do suggest that we consider a 5-year plan because I think it's going to take that long to get Dean built. And whatever plan we come up with has got to encompass getting Dean done. We do not want to be, or our successors do not want to be having this discussion in the middle of trying to finance a plan for Dean. We got to solve this now.
Mr. Loach.
I think that one of the reasons we're meeting is to give feedback to the joint committee because they're going to take the matter up apparently again in July at some point. So I think we owe them some good feedback. Mr. Wolf has put together Wolf 1, like an idea to be. I would encourage you to work with staff, get more information, vet this back through the committee when it meets. I think that the proposal that came out of the committee that did pass, although 4-2, it looks like we're taking no action on it. I may be wrong, maybe there's a motion right now to support it.
Haven't heard a motion yet.
So I don't know if that, I think we need to communicate back to the committee that, at least with head nods, that we're not quite prepared to act on that, I guess, which maybe they don't get, but so that you guys have good information to work on when you reconvene. And lastly, I do think the current proposal that came out of the committee, I think staff is probably right. I do think they should review the numbers. I think we should see the actual dollar amounts, but I have no reason to believe they would mess up essentially compound interest over a couple of years. So I think that the math is probably correct. So the best information we have right now is a best guess of 10.5 cents over 3 years, and the best math we've seen on Dean is 3.5 cents immediately to put away and help stabilize a fund to Dean. Combined, that's 14-ish cents over 3 years. So I would encourage the committee to do everything within your power to stay well shy of that high watermark. That would just be if you want feedback from a councilman who's going to have to vote on whatever you come up with. I think that there is a psychological tipping point when you have among, if not the highest tax rate in Virginia. And I would implore you to work within whatever resources you have. If we have to reprioritize both budgets to figure this out, let's do it. But I'm very shy about any projections that push us past Manassas Park at $1.55. And I think that government has a hard time explaining to people why they need their money and what they're spending it on. For me, it becomes virtually impossible when we're that high, when we're at the highest rate in Virginia. So I want to give you honest feedback so you know where I am as you're negotiating this, but I think it's a committee I'm glad I'm on, so go back and do good work.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Elston?
I don't disagree with anything that Mr. Lovejoy said.
That in a minute.
And I just want to, that was not actually my point. No, but we do have to be very careful when we talk a lot about rates and we talk a lot about bills. And though we have one of the higher rates, we have one of the lowest bills. And there is, that is a very big distinction that we just have to, I think, keep pointing out, that because of our assessed values in the city, what our citizens actually pay is one of the lowest tax bills in Northern Virginia. So I think it's just important that we keep both of those facts on the table, that both exist. So what I wanted to point out, just as we're all trying to noodle, Mr. Wolf has a proposal on the table, I have a proposal on the table. There are multiple proposals that came out of the joint committee, but we sort of, I think, have a range between 2.65 and 3.5. And each of these proposals lands somewhere in that range thus far. And so I just sort of wanted to bring that up and ask the council and the body, is that what we're sort of aiming to try to solve as a done?
Mr. Mayor?
Okay. Let me say this. We are past our time for citizens' time. I am certainly willing to meet as long as this council wishes to meet tonight and any other night. But I think we need to go do our responsibilities downstairs and listen to people who might wish to speak. And if you all would like to come back up here and further the conversation, certainly that's great by me. Let me also do this. Unlike the Joint Finance Committee that made a motion and passed it and then never took up the next meeting for the Joint Finance Committee, I would urge you all to allow staff and myself to come up with the next meeting for the City Council. And I think Mr. Avaney has a piece of information with regard to the Joint Finance Committee.
I do, Your Honor. So I did talk to the other chair, Mr. Albrecht, and we decided on a date, which I think was shared with everybody, of July 11th, which is a Wednesday at 6 p.m. in this room as the next committee meeting. July 11th, 6 p.m. in this, and it sounds like we've got some things to look at and to figure out which we can do before the next meeting on July 11th at 6 p.m.
Okay, would you all like to come back tonight? I'm not hearing a resounding yes, so let's go downstairs. Ms. Smith?
I just wanted to ask one question. When we meet again, I'd like to ask our city attorney to give us a advice on whether or not, according to our charter, you would be able to vote on this. I think the city.
I think I can answer that. Whether I would be able to vote on that?
Right, since it's a matter of money and the budget.
That's a reasonable question.
And I don't
It's
know.
not voting on a budget.
It doesn't involve our
It's
budget.
voting on a proposal. So I think I would be able to vote on this, but we'll ask.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, everybody ready? We're going downstairs.
I have a problem with these minutes. Do I